Dylan Marron is the author of the podcast Conversations with People Who Hate Me, which he describes as, quote, an experiment to see what happens when two people with very different views of the world listen to each other. He's also a voice actor playing Carlos on the podcast Welcome to Night Vale and an advocate for issues of social justice as a video maker. His video series and Tumblr blog, Every Single Word, and his interview series, Sitting in Bathrooms with Trans People, have gone viral online. He recently gave a TED Talk on turning negative online comments into positive offline conversations. Dylan Marron, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, this interview is part of the Transy Creative Intelligence lecture series, which you're appearing in on Monday, October 8th. And our theme for the campus this year is civility, which seems to be something you're after in your videos. Is that right?
In a sense, yeah. What I see conversations with people who hate me as is an experiment where I see if I can use negative online comments as a starting point for offline conversations. Now, the one big caveat I have to the word civility is that, I think civility is an ideal that we can all strive for, but I would be remiss to not acknowledge the fact that some people feel so marginalized that they justifiably don't feel that they have the energy or ability to be civil because they're just kind of fighting to survive. So I think it's important when we praise the idea of civility, which I do in general. I think it's also very important to acknowledge that it is an ideal that is available to some of us. You know what I mean?
Definitely, yes. And now for our audience, really quick, I'm going to play a quick clip from one of your podcasts, which I think demonstrates how uncivil some of these conversations can be, at least initially. And then I'll have a follow-up question for you.
It was just to focus on, being really, really eccentrically gay in the middle of the street.
Strong feelings about, this discrimination against Black people and how more Black people are put in prisons and all that stuff. But if you look at the facts and you look at the data, the reason why they're in jail more often is because they offend more.
It just seems all silly to me. The whole social justice stuff seems silly to me.
Okay. So this is just one example of the things that people say to you. And predictably, some of these conversations go better than others. In most of them, I'd say you're able to push through things that people say that undoubtedly raise your blood pressure, maybe give you a good bit of anxiety. Is that true?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it is what I have found, only speaking for myself, is that it is I so prefer speaking to people, even people I strongly disagree with, or people who don't believe in, I don't know, something very core to my existence or my existence itself. I find it so much easier to talk to them voice to voice than to project who I think they are onto the comments they've written to or about me, right? And I also should say that I have a great love for my guests because they've, taken the time to be vulnerable. They've trusted me to come on this podcast. They've trusted me with their stories when they've shared stories. So while we're very different and we have been connected through the algorithms of social media and through the fate of me seeing whatever comment they'd written about me or message they'd sent me, I think what keeps my blood from boiling is remembering that they are a human, with, of course, the hope that they will acknowledge that I'm a human too, but that's not my business. That's up to them to decide if they think I'm human. But knowing that they're human and knowing that, their circumstances created them just like my circumstances created me, is helpful to keep in mind. And that's what makes it not anxiety producing. Also, the calls themselves are my favorite part of this podcast. I love actually having the conversations. What I would say is the hard part is the stuff that listeners don't get to hear, which is me reaching out to people to be on the podcast and then people refusing, because then it just feels like, oh, well, then why write it? Whereas like the conversations you're hearing are people who are like, yeah, I'm willing to, talk about this stuff.
What percentage of people would you say are willing to appear on the podcast?
It's hard to give like an accurate percentage. I feel like I've given like a few different quotes to people over the years.
Yeah.
But at first the success rate was like 1 out of every 2, which is like wild.
Yeah.
But now is like, now I moderate conversations between people who received comments and people who sent them comments. So
Right.
That makes it significantly more challenging, because then it's not just me reaching out to one person, but rather, not only reaching out to my guests, but then working with them to find someone who they want to speak to. So it's challenging. I also don't think any work worth doing is not challenging,
Sure.
So that's not a complaint, but it's I don't know. It's hard to give a success rate. I can tell you that I reach out to like many people per week, and some materialize into episodes and some don't. So I joke frequently that I should have just made a podcast where I invite people who, like more easily bookable guests to come on and talk to me. But this is the challenge that I have set for myself, so I accept it.
Well, so you tend to open these conversations, at least it seems like in the ones where you're having the conversation with the person who insulted you. You open the conversations more with questions so that people feel okay talking to you. But it's interesting because you say at the beginning of each episode that these aren't debates, but you do end up very often discussing people's political views and where they come from. Is the question the key to that?
We do. I love that question. Thank you for asking it. I think we can acknowledge there's a difference between talking politics and debate, right? Like, meaning this is entirely hypothetical, but you and I could disagree about something, and we could talk about the disagreement. We could take a giant step back and talk about that disagreement, no matter how close the disagreement may be to one of us, but the reason I don't believe in debate as a productive tool for interpersonal communication, meaning debate, I think is one thing for like elected officials to debate over topics, right? But these are people who are about to pass laws for us. But I think that form of communication has trickled down to individual people who are not running for public office to change laws. And the reason I don't believe in debate is that I think it's gamified conversation, where at the end of it, there's a winner and a loser. And there are topics that are so complicated to talk about that you cannot distill it to a winner and loser at the end. And I think, something that's interesting that I'll share with you is that when a guest does accept my invitation to come on the show, sometimes they'll say, great, I'm looking forward to it. I can't wait to debate you. And I stop them right there and I say, no, this is not a debate. But it's so interesting that the closest approximation we all have to conversation across difference is debate. You know what I mean? Because like something that comes up a few times for the one-on-one calls is my, sexuality. I'm gay. And so like I'm not going to debate whether or not I'm gay. I'm also not that interested in debating kind of the merits of homosexuality. I'm interested in knowing why they think that. I'm interested in knowing what are they able to observe about themselves that led them to think that.
Yeah.
Why do I not yet still, so it's I don't believe in debate, and I think you can talk politics without debating.
Sure, and it seems like your thesis for this podcast, which that word thesis is very
Hmm.
problematic because you're going
Hmm.
you're going into this with such a disarmed and open, asking questions type of approach. But if you had a thesis for this podcast,
Hmm.
something that you're demonstrating gradually through the episodes, I think it seems like it would be the title of episode 2, which is that hurt people hurt people. Is that true?
I think sometimes it's true. I think the thesis for the podcast is, um, I think the thesis for the podcast is just that, like, it is incredibly productive to take online conversations offline.
Hmm.
And I now think, and also to be fair, I think when I started the podcast, I didn't know everything I know now that I'm like more than 20 episodes into the podcast. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So like, it's a constantly evolving thing where I'm learning more and more about it. So I've actually kind of worked to abandon a thesis and instead kind of go in open-minded to see what this is, what conversations are possible.
Hmm.
And yeah, that is how I see it. It's an experiment. And in terms of the thesis, hurt people, I think sometimes that's true.
Hmm.
Sometimes people who don't feel that they have a voice express it on the internet sometimes, and then other times not. That's why I don't use the word trolls, because the word troll dehumanizes a person who writes a negative comment. Now, you don't have to say like, I'm not saying some of the comments aren't really bad and hurtful. In fact, I'm inviting them on the show because they are. But it's like, I think what is most interesting to me is finding out when the people who have written negative comments about me are very much like me,
Yeah.
and are not necessarily hurting for something. They've just written something negative.
Yeah. Do you find that this has been a transformative experience for you?
Oh my God, completely. Completely. I mean, I also, like on a small scale, I just much prefer talking to people voice to voice now. And I think it's helped me use social media in a much more like conscious, ethical, mindful way, because I love social media and I love the internet. I'm so not of the school of thought like, oh, the internet is a bad place. Like the internet is an amazing place. It's a great tool. I just want to keep building, you know, infrastructure for a safer, healthier, more productive internet.
Yeah, and I wonder, some people have, hot takes, you know how they are, but
Hmm.
people
Hmm.
have raised the possibility that social media is something that has contributed to what you referred to a minute ago as gamified conversation, where people can literally score likes by
Yeah.
posting really inflammatory content. Do you think that that is where part of this came from, this really vitriolic divide?
I don't think it's where it came from. I think it's a platform, and it was a platform that humans then came onto and then continued to be humans.
Mhm.
Conspiracy theories were not invented by the internet. They can spread faster because of the internet. Negative ideas, slander was not invented with the internet. Slander long predated the internet. People attacking each other verbally was definitely not invented by social media. Um, Again, it's the problem is in our own. The problem is in the shortcomings of human psychology, or I guess to rephrase that, the humans are complicated and we are funny, weird organisms, you know,
Mhm.
and we contradict ourselves and we say things we don't mean and we struggle with communication, all of us, I'm saying.
Mhm.
And it's let's not blame a platform that enabled humans to continue being humans, you know?
Sure. And I know that psychology plays such a profound role. Like whenever I try to have a conversation about a really fraught issue, for example, with my parents who have
Mhm. Mhm.
very different political views than I do.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
I know that
Mhm.
sometimes just like pushing through that first part of the conversation is really the key because very often I think that we open with um, something that makes the other really excited, right? Like
Yeah.
somebody
Yeah.
says something. Is that something that you find is really important? Is making it through that first barrier?
I like to start all of my conversations with my guests by just asking them to tell me about them. And that I found is like one of the most disarming questions because they're experts on themselves. You
Mhm.
know, they've been living as themselves for as long as they've been alive. So it's incredibly helpful to just be like, hey, not the comment you wrote me, not the political beliefs you have. I just want you to tell me about you, and I want to hear about you. And I want to hear about you as defined by you, not as defined by this comment you've written me. And that I found is like the magical question,
Mm.
of just saying like, also it's not saying, um, it's not saying like, oh, it's totally fine what you wrote. Oh, I didn't feel anything about what you wrote, but it is still saying like, you're a human and you wrote that. So let's start with the human part. Tell me about the human that you are.
Mm.
And I appreciate that. I appreciate that just because it's like a nice way to start a conversation, especially a divisive one.
Mm. So, just to digress a little bit here, and there's no way that you can possibly answer this modestly,
Mhm.
but you're only 30, and you've
Mhm.
really produced a huge amount of content for so many different media. How do you manage to do so much with all these issues that can be so upsetting and these conversations that are so difficult to have?
Um I well, thank you. I appreciate that. Um I the way I do projects and make projects is really by doing, this is going to sound so cheesy. So you and your listeners can eye roll as hard as you want. I invite you to eye roll, but I have to make projects that I really believe in at the
Mm.
moment. Um, I think there were a lot of video series that I made before that I really, really believed were the right way to bring about change. And then I think when I took a step back, I wondered if those video series were only reverberating, and I wondered if those video series only meant something to the people who already agreed with me, right?
Mm.
So then the podcast came about. Um, so in terms of the volume of work I make, I think I just listen to what I want to. I take the time to listen to what I want to say, and I work hard to find the most accessible and productive way to say it. And and there's really no other secret other than the fact that I also love doing it.
Mm.
I love making work that creatively tackles a topic I want to talk about, you know. Um, an example that is not this podcast is Every Single Word, which is a video series that edited down popular films to only the words spoken by people of color. And I'm still proud of that because
Mm.
it took this very complex topic that I could have spent 2 hours ranting about in a vlog. But instead it was just like, okay, let me just present this in a fact-based way, let me just show this to people in a way that they can watch it in like 15 seconds. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And we have just about a minute left, so here's our last question.
Oh, great.
From your conversations, are you optimistic that Americans can work out our differences, or are we just gonna be in this partisan clash for decades?
Um, I'm optimistic because it feels pointless not to be. Um, I I'm optimistic because I choose optimism, right? It's very easy to be pessimistic. In fact, I think we see on social media sometimes it's definitely more applauded, you know, um, saying the world is trash, saying the world is a dumpster fire, saying someone is canceled. That is more fun for people than necessarily hopeful things. Are there exceptions? Totally. But that is from my vantage point how I see the internet. So I choose hope and I choose optimism because that's how I get through to the next day, you know? Do I also want to be so clear that I am like deeply afraid for the direction that communication is going? Absolutely. I don't want to negate that. And I think we have to take that incredibly, incredibly seriously because like the future is at stake, to put it like in somewhat catastrophic terms. But like how can we move forward together is something I'm incredibly interested in. And that means a kind of shift in how we think about having really complex conversations.
Dylan Marron, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.